Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today I talk with author Gracy Olmstead about the fate and future of family farms, whether the trendy concept of localism has any real meaning, our need for rootedness, and much more. Let's go. Givers, Doers, and Thinkers introduces listeners to the fascinating people and important ideas at the heart of American civil society. We speak with philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, social entrepreneurs, historians, journalists, and anyone else who will help us understand contemporary civil society's achievements and failures. We also sprinkle in practical advice for nonprofit leaders and fundraisers. My name is Jeremy Beer, and thanks for joining us. All right, thank you for being with us. Some people, I am told by our producer, Katie Janis, are actually downloading and presumably even listening to this podcast. So thanks very much for that. Shocking as that is to me. We appreciate your spending a little bit of time with us. All credit, of course, to our fine guests, since I know people aren't tuning in to hear me jabber. And we have another wonderful guest with us today, in Gracy Olmstead, a rising young star in the world of journalism. I'm sure she won't be embarrassed for me to say that about her. Gracy is a native of Idaho and a graduate of Patrick Henry College. Her work has appeared in the American Conservative, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Federalist, and elsewhere. Most excitingly, she has a new book coming out in March titled Uprooted: Recovering the Legacy of the Places We've Left Behind. I had the chance to read the book in manuscript, and it is excellent, very reflective, thought-provoking, full of Gracy's, I would say, old soul wisdom. Even though Gracy's quite young, she has an old soul. So I encourage you to pick it up, but not at Amazon if you can help it, although you can read the description and everything on Amazon right now, I saw. And so with that, I am pleased to welcome Gracy Olmstead. How are you doing, Gracy?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
It is my pleasure. First of all, can people buy your book now or no?
You can pre-order it, which I hear is a really wonderful thing to do for my sake.
Oh, and for their sake too, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, hopefully.
That's great. And it's available anyplace else other than Amazon right now?
Yeah, I think you can get it on the Penguin Random House website for sure. I think those are probably the two main places, but I'm sure other options are also going to be opening up in the next several months.
Right. Yeah, it's still a few months away, so it's great. I'm looking forward to seeing it between two covers, as I'm sure you are as well. It's your first book, right? Yes,
first book. Quite the undertaking.
Well, let's just start there. Since we're already talking about it, what's Uprooted about, and what prompted you to write it?
So Uprooted is about the farm community where I grew up back in Idaho, and about the things that when I looked back on my growing up years, I saw that really informed me as a person, and the beauties and strengths that I saw being lost as time went by. I, of course, left Idaho for Virginia in order to go to college, and then ended up getting married and staying here on the East Coast. And so there's a real tension as I look back on what is being lost and the beauties and gifts I felt like I received growing up. I begin to ask myself this question of what we owe to the past and to place, whether these places that kind of nourished us, grew us, built us up, then require something of us. And in my own case, I use that desire and that sort of guilt, if you want to call it that, as a prompt to kind of consider in a very detailed fashion what is happening in that community now, especially in its agricultural community, because my grandfather and great-grandfather and all the generations before them were farmers, and that was the form of rootedness that tied us to that region. So it's a look at agriculture, but it's also a much deeper set of questions for the individual reader about what we might owe to the places we've left behind, and how we are supposed to think about our membership within those places.
Do you find, is that a question that people, when you talk to people about this book and the thesis, or that question, what do we owe the places where we're from, or that we've left behind? Is that a question and people generally have considered in your experience, or does that strike them as a novel thing that they had not even thought of before?
It is more common than I thought. And I think oftentimes the way that it probably occurs to people is just as a general sense of homesickness or nostalgia. But generally, as you talk to them, especially as they hear my own journey of struggling with this question of should I move back at some point, they'll admit that there has been some point in their lives where they have also asked themselves that question, but it's generally a question they're asking in terms of ought I to move back? Do I have some responsibility? So I think even if it isn't something that has been articulated yet, oftentimes if we do have something that we loved growing up, that we were blessed enough, privileged enough to grow up in a home or a community that was a really good one, we do feel some sort of deep debt that perhaps we haven't ever said out loud or articulated, but is there underneath the surface. And oftentimes when you begin to mine that feeling of homesickness and analyze it and put it under a microscope, you begin to see some of those feelings of indebtedness that might be there.
What are, in the community you're from in Idaho, what was the name of the town? I know you've told me this before, but I don't remember.
Yeah. So my family homesteaded back in the day in Emmett, Idaho, and that is where the book is primarily set. My parents now live in Fruitland, which is just 2 towns over. It's just a short drive away. I wanted to focus on Emmett because of, one, the fact that that is where the generations are tied back and where the family land was, but also because it's an extremely interesting, in my mind, agricultural community. It's in this valley surrounded by mountains, and so it's very kind of cut off and serves as a very interesting microcosm of some different trends within the realm of agriculture, but it's also adopted those trends at just a very slightly slower pace than some of the rest of the country. So whereas, for instance, in places like Iowa, you have these massive sprawling thousands of acre farms. In Emmett, you still have, I think the largest farm is probably between 800 to 1,000 acres, which is still
small in these days.
Kind of mid-sized to small. So I was very curious too about why it's preserved some of this sense of smallness and locality, and wanted to look at that in more depth as well.
What are some of the I know you've looked into this in terms of sort of the history of American agriculture and recent trends. What, maybe in beyond agriculture, you can talk about this as well, but what have been some of the disintegrating forces that have sort of acted as this sort of dispersal impetus for people like you, people like me, away from smaller towns and rural communities?
Well, there's a lot of simple economic trends that I think we can trace through a lot of American economic life over the last several decades, in which you have kind of a quick economics consolidation from end of World War II, perhaps, to the present time, which also results in kind of just this proliferation of big name brands. The way you can think about it in terms of your grocery store, for instance, is that when you go in and look at the toothpaste shelf, you might see 50 different kinds of toothpaste, but there's actually only 3 corporations that probably own all those different kinds of toothpaste.
Like
and
rental cars.
Yeah. And agriculture is similar. You have a broad swath of farms across the countries, but in terms of the agribusinesses that they work for, in terms of the crops that they sell, and the methodologies and the seeds even that they use, there's been this massive homogenization and consolidation over time. There are some political reasons for that. If you look at the way we've formulated farm policy from the New Deal, Farm Bill era forward, that was really fostering a vision for agriculture that was much more fixated on global trade than it was around actually fostering diversity in small communities. And in the New Deal era already, you had problems with overproduction as a result of World War I planting. That meant that they thought the answer to problems of overproduction was to actually take more farmers out of the equation.
Right.
And so they were very targeted in how they handed out aid at the time, which had horrible consequences for a lot of sharecroppers and tenant farmers and people of color who ended up being disinvested of their property during that era. But also just in terms of the actual landscape across America, there was a hollowing out and a loss of people on the land as a result of federal policy from that time frame forward. So economics and politics, I also think if you look at culture, we have this very strange set of messages in America, which seem to suggest that living in a rural place is kind of settling, and that settling itself is a bad thing. And I think that's had an impact on younger generations as they decide whether to stay in place or to leave. When all of your values, when all of your pop culture heroes and heroines are cosmopolitan, urban, sophisticated in a way that you might not associate with country folk, then it definitely establishes some incentives that divorce people from the ideas of rootedness that I think are just integral to being able to foster a healthy agricultural landscape. So it's such a mixed and very multifaceted bag of things, but those are maybe a few that stand out.
Well, behind any huge trend like this, there are always multiple factors, right? There's not just one thing. And you've laid out several, but so it's interesting. Of course, I mean, you're right. I think that all the cultural signals are, to settle, as you put it, in like a small town, Iowa or Idaho or Indiana, where I'm from. It's definitely to sort of be on the B list at best, right? Maybe the C list. In terms of how you stack up to your peers and where you are culturally or on the social prestige ladder. But yet we have this sort of, at least before March 2020, when everything sort of has changed, is sort of, localism was cool to talk, to think of oneself as a localist. Obviously, for now, half a generation or more, community-supported agriculture and buying, local food, being a locavore, et cetera, has been cool. Farming is kind of cool again. How does that trend, those trends, fit into your narrative or this story?
It is kind of interesting seeing how I think perhaps the millennial generation, and we'll see about generations after as well, but the millennial generation in particular seems to not be content with uprootedness. That at least that just is my theory at this point, and I could be proved entirely wrong. But there's some real hungers and thirsts, I think, within this demographic to have a sense of roots, a sense of place. And I think you see a lot of that in their turn toward things like the locavore movement, toward a very deep interest in local civic involvement on the part of many, and a desire to have a deeper understanding of how their region ticks. Of course, I think insofar as it's trendy, that can result in perhaps a sense of shallow commitment that's not going to fix any problems. If we treat localism like a consumer trend, something you can kind of dabble in insofar as you want to, that doesn't fix any problems. It's part and parcel of a larger consumeristic attitude on the part of a lot of Americans that tend to actually divorce us from deep-rootedness. But it's also interesting kind of on the policy standpoint. I think what you've seen is this small niche movement of bipartisan thinkers over the last few years that recognizes that kind of broad top-down solutions tends to make a lot of things worse. There was a book that came out, I'm sure you know about, The New Localism, by Bruce Katz and Jeremy Nowak, who are, I think, Brookings Institution scholars. Right. And they were looking at these cities that picked themselves up from kind of being in very bad shape and were able to fix things that needed to be fixed. But they were able to do it because of this localist approach in which you had a great degree of flexibility between private and public sectors, between local government leaders, nonprofits, business leaders, in addition to a lot more community accountability because it was local. And these resulted in building policies that were just so much more particular and nuanced and achievable and modest, probably in terms of price tag, than what we normally get at the federal level. And a lot of these cities are very progressive cities, but they were recognizing the fact that within this idea of subsidiarity, there's grace, there's wiggle room, there's diversity and nuance that you just don't have when the federal government is calling all the shots. And so that was a really interesting development that I think hopefully won't die out entirely, one would hope. And then, of course, I even saw an article back, it was probably 2 years ago, in Vox about the idea of gun localism, once again written by someone who is quite liberal, but recognizing that maybe with issues of Second Amendment policy and gun control, there would be something more that we could do to move the ball forward if instead of talking merely on the national level, we were thinking more locally. So I think there's room still for that to grow and change and develop over time. It is interesting how this year, with a lot of people stuck at home, not commuting, not having the same amount of flexibility in their schedules, not being as car centric, there's been, I think, a lot of local communal spirit that has resulted through this kind of COVID era. And I saw a piece in the Wall Street Journal even just a few days ago about kind of the comeback of the front porch, which
I saw that too.
Exciting to see. Yeah. So
my neighbor just added a front porch to their house just in the last month, which I thought was the most interesting development I've seen in a long time. They carved out some of their yard and built a front porch. I don't know if they would have done that if we weren't going through what we're going through right now. My concern about all of this, Gracie, I love the sort of optimistic, if one thinks that localism is a good thing, the optimistic tone you're striking. My concern is that it's sort of limited to sort of technocracy, it's a better technocratic solution than a top-down solution, and it's not an actual commitment to self-government or a meaningful geographical and cultural diversity. Is that a concern I'm right to have, or is that just me being a pessimistic fuddy-duddy?
Well, I think it's definitely a legitimate concern. Like I said, you're probably striking the fact that, or taking note of the fact that, whereas I said, on perhaps more of the individual, like millennial level, this can be very like wishy-washy and consumeristic. Like there can be a trend within the political policy realm of things to also kind of just think of things as an easy solution to an equation, as opposed to the sort of deep involvement, the sort of saying, I am in this for the long haul, no matter what it takes attitude, which is just absolutely pivotal for this to actually work. And I think it's hard to be able to say for certain how it's going to work out until the going gets really tough, which this year has, in many instances, been really tough on people. And one thing you do see, which I think is important to point out, is people moving out of places that are tough to live in right now. And that is the exact sort of trend, which is the opposite of what localism would actually call you to do.
Yeah, it's actually there's a lot of irony in all of that, because where they're moving back to are one can foresee a future in which small and mid-sized cities and towns in rural America now gets an influx of people that were living in larger metropolitan areas, perhaps particularly on the coast. And so you're right. There's interestingly, that's sort of an abandonment of its own. Although it might also be characterized in many cases as a return for some of these sorts of people. So it's irony upon irony in that trend, if it is in fact a trend.
Yeah. And then the question becomes, will they stay once they leave? Which I feel like some people, at least I've heard, are moving back to parents or extended family. I think there was probably a broad realization in this time that in fact, multi-generational living is way easier and way better than nuclear family living in times of stress, whether financial or physical or otherwise. And so I think I heard at least a dozen reports of, young families who moved in with their parents, their kids' grandparents, so that they could have some of the emotional support, some of the child care help. It was like when everything else fell apart, they realized, this is what I have that will last. And so I think people moving in order to realize that more fully are recognizing something good. It's going to be more challenging probably than they expect it to be, because once again, they're moving into a place where if they grew up there, they have a set of debts and dependencies and obligations that they probably didn't have before. But insofar as they're able to keep those goods in mind, I think hopefully those people will continue to stay and invest there. We will see.
We will see. Hey, and we will be right back with Gracy Olmstead, author of the forthcoming Uprooted, Recovering the Legacy of the Places We Left Behind, right after this practicality. All right, we are back, and I have with us for today's practicality Justin Strife. He's a partner of mine at American Philanthropic and has run a number of nonprofits development departments over the years. And so question now, I think, Justin, people probably would be listening to this, I don't know, October or November 2020, if they're listening to it pretty shortly after it comes out. And if you're in the nonprofit sector, what is on your mind right now is besides bringing in funds here at the end of calendar year 2020, it's planning for 2021, right? A lot of people, if you're doing it right, you should be sort of doing some planning for 2021. What, in your mind, should people be looking at as they plan for 2021? What do you look back at in 2020 to kind of help you with that planning process?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Jeremy. And so really, I want to start off with just a couple disclaimers, which are really, ideally you're doing multi-year planning. Obviously, that's ideal. But if you can only do 1 year planning, that's fine. And when we talk about planning, especially around here, we typically mean written plans, institutionally important plans, not a plan in your head that you thought up in the shower and said, I think I'll shoot for this. It is a written plan that everyone knows about.
Shower plans are not plans.
Shower plans are not plans. Okay, right. Maybe for your day, that's a shower plan is good, but not for, raising a few $1 million for the next year. And this gets really hard at the year end, as you know, because we got year end craziness. We've got holidays. We've got everything else. We've probably got board meetings. It gets really hard. But as fundraisers, particularly directors of development, we need to set aside time and to do this. So I want to touch on just a few things if I can.
Make it fast.
All right, I'll make it fast. So the first one is review your past goals and performance before setting new ones. And that's pretty obvious. But what I mean really right off the bat is start with top line revenue. What was the goal? And did you hit it? Or I know we're in October. Are you going to hit it? Yeah. If you blew it out of the water, you probably set your goals a little too low and maybe you need to be a little bit more aggressive. If you fell short, where did you fall short? And really digging into your data and figuring that out. And maybe you need to be more realistic next year. And on top of that, set those expectations, which is where I want to get into next. And it's tied to this, which is it's important to be thoughtful about your top line revenue goals. In order to be thoughtful as an organization, it needs to be bottom up, not top down.
So wait, hold on. Let me just stop you right there. So a great way to plan isn't for the president, CEO, or board chair to walk in the room and say, hey, next year, it's 4 million or whatever, some random number, and then you.
It's a great way to plan that way if you want a disaster. If you're looking for disaster,
we've seen those, Justin. We've seen those.
If you want 2020 all over again, do that. Yeah. No, really, what you want bottom down. I really encourage this, which is the president or the board says, "How much can we raise next year?" You tell me first,
right?
And then what happens is gift officers say, "My caseload was $1 million this year; it can handle $1.5 million next year." And then foundations, and you go through all of it. Right. And then you come back and say, we can do 4 million next year. And the board chairman says, I really need you to do 4.25. Can we do some horse trading here?
That's a more reasonable sort of negotiation to be having at
this time. Because we've all been on this, we're like, yeah, exactly. Raise 10 million. Well, we raised 3 last year. What do you want me to do here? Yeah. So really setting those goals and going from bottom to the top. Mm-hmm. Second is look at renewal and attrition rates. It is way easier, way cheaper, more profitable, more efficient to retain a donor, a current donor, than it is to bring in a new one.
I just had somebody argue with me about this last week. It's amazing that everybody doesn't understand that. There is no argument.
There's no argument.
It's cheaper to retain and renew.
Cheaper, better. The next best major donor in your file or in your list is in your file already. Yep. Someone giving you $100 today is your next $10,000 donor. Way easier to find that $10,000 donor through upgrading than it is out of the blue. Right. So look at those and look at retention and attrition. What are you doing right? Look at the trends. Don't just look at the last year. Look at the last 3, 4, 5 years. Are you improving? Are you declining? If you're declining, what are you doing wrong? Look at your mail, whatever it might be. And then third, I would say review time on task and time on task for revenue generating work. And typically that comes down to meetings and mail.
Yeah.
If you're not spending enough time and money on meetings and mail, that's probably a big problem. If you look at it and your gift officers aren't doing meetings, big problem. If they're looking at spreadsheets and not across from a donor and at their office, big problem.
Same with your CEO and president.
Same with the CEO,
program people, maybe.
If your CEO is spending, a small amount of time with donors, either on the phone or in meetings, that's a big problem. And then also mail. If you're not in the mail, that's a problem. With major donors, with lower level donors, you have to be in the mail. So really analyze that time on task for revenue generating work. 2020
is the year we discovered yet again that mail does work. So if you're listening to this and you don't think that, you can just shoot me a note and I'll tell you why you're wrong.
Exactly right.
Thanks, Justin. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We are back with Gracy Olmstead, author, journalist. Gracy, we've been talking about community, and that's obviously a concern of yours, sort of how do we build or recover healthy communities? One thing we often read or hear is, hey, the internet is the new site for community, social media, et cetera. And that's, that we just sort of need to come to grips with that. That's where community happens now. Is that an actual substitute? How's that working out for us? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, let me ask you, do you feel like your Facebook feed is making you feel super warm and fuzzy right now? Like, does it just make you feel like the world is this wonderful, harmonious place full of peace and people just getting along together perfectly? Because I haven't had that experience on social media.
I got off Facebook and literally all social media back in late May, early June for precisely the reasons you're indicating. Yes. So no, the answer is no. And I guess I'm not alone in that.
No, I've been off for the most part. One of the funny things is being a mom of toddlers and starting preschool this year. It seems like a lot of collective organizing and event organizing or social groups tend to gather on Facebook. And so I found that in terms of just finding out how to, sort out curriculum issues or whatever, there's sometimes a necessary evil component with Facebook. But insofar as I can keep off of it for 6 out of 7 days of the week, I am very happy. But no, it hasn't formed any sort of thick, nourishing community. It's done the opposite, in my opinion. I think this year has been so fraught politically, emotionally for many people, financially. And it seems as if the format of social media tends to just encourage fighting and discord and a lot of brokenness that has been really sad to see. And I don't think that it has to be that way, but perhaps it.
You don't think the medium itself sort of has a logic to it or drives that kind of, I don't have an answer to this, but we only have the one experiment we've done over the last 15 years, and it seems as if there is a sort of a logic that even if our social media masters were inclined to change our algorithms in some way, that it would not encourage polarization. It almost seemed as if the medium itself has some sort of inclination in it that drives us toward that sort of discord and anger and all the rest of it.
I think that very well could be. And it does seem to just manifest that over time as we continue to use it. It seems as if there is maybe a tendency more toward that way with one medium than another. So I would say, for instance, and I could be completely alone in this, but something like Instagram seems much more innocuous than a platform like Facebook that is constantly asking for your opinion and for the airing of whatever,
Airing of grievances and great style, yes.
Yeah. But at the same time, Instagram to me doesn't seem to foster any sort of real community either. It's a very kind of passive platform where you post pretty things and then log off again. So there's not real community there either, for the most part at least. But what I've wondered and have talked to some people about in the past is whether there could be a way to use social media subversively, with the sense of, this is something that is full of ills I need to avoid at every turn. However, perhaps what I can do with it is use it in the exact way they don't want me to, which is to use it to get people to gather in person in real time. Because I think what you're recognizing, which I think is true, is that insofar as it's all about being online with people, it will always be broken, because we are the best versions of ourselves when we are experiencing each other's presence and actually looking someone in the eyes and reckoning with their true soul and individuality in the moment, as opposed to some sort of mediated through a screen interaction in which we always seem to kind of divorce the full person from themselves and to think of them as an avatar or a stereotype instead of them as they are.
We have to reckon with someone's being. They're real, yes. In fact, being when we're with them in person, and that certainly seems to have a moderating effect that we never had to think about before until we really had the opportunity not to think about people in that way. You've written, so if the internet is not the new site for community, you've actually written about what is a new site for a community, and it's really interesting. I'd like you to talk about it. CrossFit and Soul Cycle, I think, are the two examples you gave in a piece you wrote a year or two ago about how those have become sites for real community for people in the way they're replacing churches and religion in people's lives. Can you talk about that?
Well, I have to give Tara Isabella Burton credit for the original idea, which sparked my article. She wrote a book called Strange Rites about kind of modern religious belief and sentiment and spirituality. And she was looking at where people find meaning apart from organized religion, because there has been a movement away from organized religion. And one of those, which was really fascinating, was CrossFit and Soul Cycle. I do wonder how all those poor people have been doing this year, because most gyms have been closed.
They've probably been, most places anyway. I'm sure they've been struggling. It'd be interesting to get a survey on that.
It would. But the basic idea was just that within the church, not only is there a consistent source of community, which you are vulnerable with, at least hypothetically, in which you find a support system in, but also within the church, there's a set of rituals, daily, weekly, that you participate in that give you a sense of larger, even globalized community. And CrossFit and Soul Cycle both had this. They both organize their workout schedules around a sort of globalized liturgy in which every CrossFit everywhere or every Soul Cycle everywhere is a part of these rhythms and rituals together. And what Tara was recognizing and writing about was that there is this deep need in our human soul for rhythm, for ritual, for this sense of being plugged into something that is beyond and above ourselves. And that's not just connecting us with one particular person, but with an entire body of believers in whatever that set of beliefs might be. And that perhaps in our own time, people were finding it in exercise, which sounds really funny. But if you think about the whole set of beliefs around exercise, the before and after, kind of this almost redemptive story of I was this and now I'm this, and Soul Cycle or CrossFit brought me here. It does mirror a lot of religious language. And so it was really fascinating to kind of look at all of that and see how people will find it where they can if they're not finding it in a church.
There's another way it strikes me that it is like faith, or the demands of faith, in that it demands something of you. It is not right. It's hard. CrossFit's really hard. I've never done Soul Cycle. It's really hard, and it really demands something of you. And so it seems like we don't want to have anything demanded of us, which is one reason why I think we're very happy to substitute a social media community for a real community where all sorts of messy and irksome demands are made on us from others. But when we pick up the challenge of it, some sort of demand that's hard, and confront it and work through it, it's really, really gratifying. And we know that has built something in us that we didn't have before. Does that strike you as right?
I think it is. And you just made me realize something that I don't think I had realized before. I think the sourdough trend this year follows all the same notes, actually.
Yeah.
Of like a globalized community built around this singular ritual of feeding a starter and then making bread with it. And a habit that is in fact kind of hard. You always have loaves that don't turn out and you don't know why. And it makes me wonder whether that was another source of solace for people when their gym closed down.
The other thing that strikes me, and I've been thinking about a lot recently, is there does seem to be a kind of, and maybe this is another sort of where the church has receded, something will fill that vacuum. It's almost like a mania for unity. At least that's the phrase that keeps coming up into my mind. Like this sort of, not that unity is a bad thing, but there's a sort of, we must have it. Why don't we have it? There's a sort of manic, almost hysterical need, it seems like, for unity lurking behind many of our public arguments and denunciations of those who are sort of that we accuse of preventing us from achieving that kind of unity. Is this another? What's behind that? What is that about? I mean, do you sense that same need? For all our talk of diversity, that seems to be what's really sort of driving a lot of angst. Do you sense the same thing? And if so, what is that about?
So it's interesting. I would say, once again, going back to social media, which is, I apologize for that.
Or not to.
My Facebook feed is very conservative, very Republican. So a lot of people I know back home in Idaho. And my Twitter feed is extremely progressive oftentimes because it's more of the journalists that I know and have friendships with. And I have noticed, I think, throughout this year, this sort of rhetoric on both sides of, don't you get it? You log on and someone is preaching at you. Don't you get it? This is unavoidably true. What is your problem? You need to come over to this camp or that camp. But the rhetoric can be very similar on both sides. I think there's always a tendency that we have as humans to think that whatever solution we ourselves see is the most fit for the problem at hand, we want everyone else to adopt it. But perhaps in this era of kind of, as we talked about, there's kind of this massive homogenization and consolidation of so many different things, and our parties seem to be following this trend as well. Any sort of nuance or complexity or I agree with you here, but not there, gets lost in the shouting that tends to take place. And maybe social media is exacerbating that as well. But it does seem like there is just a loss of mystery and nuance that are really important. And that has been sad to see and difficult to see, especially for someone like me who doesn't feel like I fit perfectly anywhere in terms of politics.
Right.
And I think the beauty of localism as an offering at the present moment, of course, is that it allows for and in fact encourages diversity of thought and of policy and suggests that, whatever works for you in Chicago or in Tallahassee or in Houston should look very different from what works in small town Idaho or Los Angeles or New York City. It's about specificity and about seeking to build the set of policies that fit the place and the person, not the other way around, trying to fit everyone into the same mold, which is what we seem to see a lot of right now.
I don't know if you've thought about this. I'm just going to spring it on you, but what is the difference between localism and populism? Another ism that we hear a lot about now, I have for the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. It doesn't strike me, and perhaps I feel like you would be able to give the much more educated answer to this, but it doesn't strike me that populism is very local.
Right.
It's focused on grassroots energy and activism, but not at targeting where you live so much as using that energy to change something on a more national, federal level. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I actually, I don't have a great answer to this question either. But I think you're right that populism sort of already proceeds from the premise or truth or fact that there's a sort of there's like a mass, people in the mass rather than people who are placed and rooted, right? And it's not any more attentive to local diversity and difference than progressivism would be. Like there's sort of two sides in that way. They sort of mirror one another.
Yeah, and like you just said, it then seems that populism always turns into populism of the left or of the right, like it follows the same party lines.
Mm-hmm. I see. Seems to me a understandable reaction to a placelessness and to being a feeling of resentment that one's has been stripped of what is one's own or what one deserves, but it doesn't mean it's a healthy thing. I guess is the way it's understandable, but not healthy is the way I guess I sort of think about populism, that it's a sort of already something has gone bad when you have populist movements. Although I'm not sure our friend Patrick Deneen would agree with me on that. But it seems something like that seems like it's the case to me.
Yeah. Well, my question that I don't have a good answer for, and I'd be curious to hear different people's opinions on, is whether populists feel very empowered right now. Because it doesn't seem as if anything that is actually happening would lead to a sort of feeling of, yes, no. I am achieving my purposes and I am an empowered citizen as a result of what our political landscape looks like. Whereas I think you could say the person who is very much focused on reform and change in their town or city is going to come up against tons of disillusioning realities, but their voice is a little bit louder and their ability to push back is a little bit stronger at that level than it is if they see themselves as part of this large populist fight, which is going to take down all the powers that be in the nation.
Well, given that so if that's the case, that, hey, there's something you could do focusing more locally and get a sense of sort of satisfaction out of it and really make some sort of actual difference rather than just sort of screaming into the void. Why are we so reluctant to participate in civil society now more than certainly now more than we were a generation ago and certainly 2 generations ago? What's behind that reluctance?
That's a good question. I think it's hard, as you already pointed out. It's probably a discipline or a habit that we've lost. And as we've lost some of the associations and habits that made it easier, it's hard to get that ball rolling again. I think probably it's hard in the sense that people often feel they don't have time, depending on their commute, their work schedule. Once again, living in a more car-centric society, having longer commutes, I think, can impact a lot of things. And this is probably one of them. But also, it's hard in the sense that you have to deal with people face to face who might disagree with you very strongly and who might even annoy you. And there's a set of courtesies around that sort of day-to-day confrontation that we probably aren't used to in this area of our era of social media bubbles, and being able to really curate our lives and associations to a much larger degree. When you go to a town hall meeting with your neighbors, you have to deal with the diversity of their thoughts and opinions and backgrounds, and you have to show empathy in a way that you don't have to when you log on to Instagram or Facebook and just unfollow the people who bug you.
Right.
And I think that can be a rude awakening for people who think that they're going to be able to, change things, and then they bump into actual human persons. And the beauty of it, of course, is that at the national level, there's so much gridlock, right? We always hear about that between the two political parties. And the art of compromise seems to be something that is lost in a lot of ways. But at the local level, I think the opportunity to exercise and practice the art of compromise and the art of empathy is still possible. It's just something we have to probably relearn and actually remind ourselves that, no, this is the basis of community. This is what it's all about, because we forget.
It's interesting because the technological cocoon in which we can live if we wish definitely produces a kind of impatience. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I'm sure there are studies on this. Yeah, I feel it myself. Like the more I'm online, the less patient I am with the world. And sometimes you find yourself thinking like, hit Control Z. Like, no, I can't do that. This is real life. I can't undo. I can't fast forward. So that is one thing. It is not a school of the sort of patience and empathy, as you were putting it, that we actually need to work in civil society. It also, at the same time, that very same technology disincentivizes compromise. Like you're saying, we've kind of lost the art of compromise at the national level, but there's no doubt, right, that is directly associated with the sort of the way technology and social media can divide us into camps very quickly and really punish people who compromise, right? Because extremists have the loudest voices on social media. So it's all sorts of bad things we can trace back to this stuff. It seems like how do we get out of it? Like
just time to log off. Everyone should take a break, at least through beginning of November. We should just.
Well, I hear you, but really, in your book, I assume you must have a couple of, maybe I don't know that you do, but draw a couple of practical recommendations from the research you do and the sort of delving into your experience and your family's experience in Idaho. I mean, what would you say is a way forward that could lead us to a healthier place?
In terms of like economic policy, farm
everything.
Everything.
Give me two things, socially, economically, personally.
Well, when it comes to farm communities specifically, there's always this very interesting tension that exists between kind of the more libertarian camp that just wants the government to get out of farming, and more of a progressive camp, which suggests that we should be trying to rejuvenate what is broken by putting funds into small beginning farmers, into getting more a diverse landscape of crops, of people onto the landscape, and promoting a diversity that currently isn't there. And I find the very interesting thing is that oftentimes, at least amongst my fellow conservatives, who I seek to address in a couple different parts of the book, there's this assumption that we've had a free market capitalist farm system up until now, and that now it's just a matter of figuring out how to get out of supporting farms or what have you. And so I try very deliberately to show how we have always kind of invested in the players that we wanted to win in this particular battle. And that oftentimes those have been the largest 10% of farms that get all of the subsidies, the cushiest crop insurance, what have you. And so kind of trying to explain why then you have to ask yourself this question, which I think applies to other forms of policy when it comes to broken places as well, which is, do you just stop supporting the biggest, largest players and pull out entirely and let the broken places try and mend themselves? Or does the government have a responsibility, given the policies it's created and the impacts they've had, to try and at least staunch the wound slightly? And that's a very complicated, difficult question. I think Patrick Deneen, in his book, Why Liberalism Failed, it's failed, right? Past tense? Okay, thank you. I think what he recognizes is that perhaps one of the biggest problems is that when the government does try to repair wounds or brokenness in a lot of communities, it comes in with programs that focus on big players or individual people or nuclear families. And what we're trying to do is restore the associations that led to a sense of local empowerment, that led to a very healthy, vibrant community. And so the way in which we invest needs to look different. It needs to be more communal. It needs to be more associational, institutional, instead of so focused on the individual players. And I think that's a very fascinating thing and could have a lot of applications both in the realm of farms and in the realm of just larger communities as a whole in their civic and cultural life. So I really like kind of it's not a blueprint. And I love that. I think Patrick Deneen is so good about this, saying there's no one size fits all solution. And so there is no blueprint. It's really about trying to find a set of values that we want to act upon with humility and modesty and be willing to implement them incrementally so that if we realize it's not working, we're able to change.
Gracy, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure, as always, to get to talk to you.
Gracy's book, coming out in March 2021, is Uprooted: Recovering the Legacy of the Places We Left Behind. And if you must find her on Twitter, she is at Gracy Olmstead. That is Olmstead. Thanks, Gracy. Take care.
Thank you.